I am very pleased, on behalf of the Libertarian Alliance, to welcome to this conference Dr. Syed Kamall, a member of the European Parliament. I should imagine that most of us here would regard ourselves as Eurosceptics. In fact, many of us might well believe that the European Union is a fundamentally evil institution and that Britain should leave it at the earliest opportunity. However, I think we need to accept that the European Union does exist. Whether it should exist is another matter, but it does exist, and it is arguable that if the European Union must exist, then we do need people like Syed to speak up for truth and justice in the European Parliament. Now, Syed will speak for maybe 10-15 minutes, and what he wants to do is to raise a number of issues to which he does not necessarily have an answer, and he looks to the members of this audience to suggest answers of their own. And so we are doubly fortunate. We are being addressed by a member of Parliament for the European Union, and we have the opportunity to address ourselves to a member of the European Parliament. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Syed Kamall.
First, thank you very much for inviting me to address you here at Libertarian Alliance Conference. I've known Chris and Brian for more years than I care to mention, because I try and look youthful. But if I mention that, then it gives the game away, it gives my age away. I just really want to pay, before we start, just pay tribute, particularly to Chris, for all the help and advice he's given me over the years. As I was seeking to sort of get into elected politics, whenever I had a sort of philosophical dilemmas, Chris and Brian are two people that I have turned to constantly throughout my adult life, throughout my political career, to help me debate certain issues. Because it's all very well us having all these ideas and thinking that I'm a man of ideas, but when you become an elected politician, that's when you have to start delivering something, and you actually have to think about how the philosophical ideas fits into a pragmatic political context. I remember a few years ago talking to Sean, and Sean said, I started off the sentence by saying, Sean, I'm not a libertarian, but, and I was going to go on to say, I'm not a libertarian, but I agree with many libertarian ideas. And before I could go on, Sean said to me, yes, Syed, but that's better than people who actually say, I am a libertarian, but. So what I really want to do today, and you can phrase how you want, maybe the spin I'll put on it is I'll call it consultation. But what I really want to do is talk to you, put a bit about my job and my role as a member of the European Parliament in context. And then talk through some of the issues that I face as a parliamentarian, and then talk about one particular philosophical dilemma I face. And I really do want you to sort of contribute to this, so I can go away with, hopefully with a firmer idea of the side of the argument I should come down on. Because as someone once said to me, if you sit on the fence for a long time, it gets pretty painful. And that's exactly what I want to avoid. So let me set the scene for you and how different it is. How many of you are here, for example, are from Britain? No, so how many of you are not British here? How many of you are from continental Europe, as we say? Or if you're a federalist, you say the mainland, but I don't say that. Okay, fine. So, for me, one of the first things about becoming a member of the European Parliament was the difference in political culture. Here in Britain, we have a political culture where usually we have a debate, and then the debate is followed by votes at the end of the debate. And that's something you get very used to. What's very different about being out in Brussels or in Strasbourg, because we have two parliamentary buildings, and that's another issue, which I don't really want to go into at this stage. What's very different about debating in Brussels and Strasbourg is that sometimes we'll have a debate on a particular issue, and then we may not vote on that particular issue until 2 or 3 months later. Which means that unless you're intimately involved with the issue in mind, by the time the vote comes round, you've quite often forgotten what the issue is all about. Now, some would say that allows time for more discourse and discussion and so we can come to a sensible agreement. But maybe the more cynical of us would say, well, actually, all it allows is for deals to be made behind closed doors between the political parties to continue with this consensus. And you know that consensus is built into the whole system, particularly when you look at the debating chamber. And I'm sure you've all heard this, but I'll repeat it, that we have a political culture which is very adversarial, where the opposition faces the government and holds them to account. And it's all done in an adversarial way, and it's good-humoured outside that chamber, but at times, watching Prime Minister's question times, it can seem pretty antagonistic. In the European Parliament, we sit in a horseshoe-shaped parliament, very similar to a lot of continental European parliaments, and that tries to build in consensus. Effectively, we're all on the same side, and I'm often trying to work out who's on the other side. And I suppose it's people people like me who don't necessarily see consensus as a good thing. I see emerging consensus as a good thing once you've had your debate, but I don't see consensus as a good thing when you start off. I'm one of these politicians who's quite happy to challenge that consensus over time. And also the voting system is very bizarre. I mean, as I said, we have the votes separate from the debates, but when it comes to the votes, because we've had debates months and months previously, we quite often bundle up our votes. So anyone who's been to Strasbourg and see a Strasbourg session, you'll see on a Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, we have 1 hour a day for voting. And it's purely votes. So, and what that means is that all the debates that have taken place over the recent weeks and possibly months, all those votes are bundled up in 1 hour. And we vote, and unless you're intimately involved in a particular piece of legislation, you quite often have no idea what you're voting on. And the reason you know what you're voting on is because we produce something called a whips list, which is where the chief whip will talk to the particular spokesman on that issue and say, you know, what is the line on this issue. But unless I've been actually actively following a particular subject, I just follow the party line. And that's the way the system is out there. And it's further complicated when you think about the voting system. We have hundreds and hundreds of votes in 1 hour. And we also have simultaneous translation. There have been a couple of incidents when I've heard the translator say in my ear, all those in favour, only to see the chairman in his or her own language say all those in favour, all those against. And I've been voted at the same time and wondered, actually, how did I vote in that debate? I mean, fortunately, we have sort of an electronic check, and you can request an electronic check at any time. But there have been a few votes where I'm not certain which way I've actually voted because of that delay in translation. And you also have to rely on the quality of your voting list. And there was a particular vote when I was dutifully following the line, and I saw the words free vote. I thought, yes, well, that's fine. You know, you and I know what a free vote is. It's a vote of conscience. What do I personally believe on this issue? But I thought, yeah, that's all very well, but what's the issue? So I turned to my colleague, a very charming German Christian Democrat lady, and I said, you know, what are we voting on? You know, it's a free vote. What are we voting on, and how are you voting? She said, oh, don't worry about that. She said, if it's a free vote, I always vote yes, even if I don't know what the issue is. And that really seriously got me thinking. I mean, it wouldn't be funny. You know, it's so true. It really got me thinking about this whole idea about the European Parliament supposedly filling this democratic deficit. I mean, you know, how has it? How does it fill a democratic deficit? But, you know, as Sean said, and I say, when trying to justify the fact that I get paid this money to be a member of the European Parliament, we don't start from a state of nature. We start from where we are now. We don't start from page 1 of Nozick. You know, we start from where we are today. We have the European Parliament. We have all the European institutions in place. And so, you know, what can I do as a practical politician to make sure that I am abiding by my principles when I'm considering the vote? And that becomes very difficult, especially when you don't know what you're voting on, quite frankly. The other thing about the whole place out there is you have to wonder what century you're in. When you look at the European Union budget, and you look at about 40% of it is spent on agriculture, and we are talking at the same time, and we have this thing called a Lisbon agenda. I think it started 5 years ago, and we said by 2010, the European Union will be the most competitive economy in the world. It will be based on a digital competitive economy. I don't know what they meant by digital, maybe they meant counting on your fingers. But this is supposed to be the most competitive economy in the world. 5 years into this, we are still spending 40% of our EU budget on agriculture. impression of an economy that understands the realities of the modern world. That doesn't give me the impression of an economy that understands what's happening in China, what's happening in India, what will happen in other countries that liberalise, what will happen in other countries that take advantage of their comparative advantage, what will happen in a world where trade barriers are lowered and lowered, and you have countries that we're not even thinking about at the moment that will become more and more competitive. I saw a survey the other day talking about the whole outsourcing industry. And when people talk about outsourcing, they think about India and all the call centres out there, all the IT software. But if you look at the projections for the growth of the outsourcing industry, it will be more than China and India can handle between them. That means there are plenty of opportunities for other countries to restructure their economies, to move away from being sugar economies or banana economies or whatever they currently rely on. And they themselves could bring themselves, they could leapfrog, if you like, sort of industrial development and 20th century industrial development and be modern leading edge economies. But yet, all we seem to do is that we seem to keep spending 40% on agriculture, and we also seem to be encouraging a dependency culture in former colonies. 40 years after independence in many of these countries, we are still encouraging dependency culture. I'll give you an example. My parents came from Guyana in the 1950s and 1960s. In 1966, Guyana became independent. 40 years later, we are still paying Guyanese sugar producers 3 times market price, world market price, for their sugar. No wonder there is no incentive for them to restructure and really face the changes and really face the challenges of the 21st century. I have disagreements with Guyanese politicians all the time. I say to them, look where you are, and those of you know Guyana, it's geographically in South America, just on top of Brazil. English is their first language. They have an education system from the 1950s in Britain, which is still widely respected, while our own education system has degraded in this country. Their second language is Spanish. A lot of them also learn Portuguese at school. It makes you think that when you think about Guyana and those what economists call advanced factors, Guyana could be setting itself up as a hub for US multinationals for the whole of Central and Southern America. But when you speak to the politicians, they say, we've relied on bananas for years, we've relied on sugar for years, we need some help from the EU. I thought, well, don't you get enough help? You know, we're paying you 3 times market rate for your sugar. Oh no, but we need some aid to restructure our economy. They don't seem to understand the concept of opening up your markets and let the foreign investors come in and build your economic infrastructure to become a major service centre for the whole of Central and Southern America. And I think another sort of one of my big regrets about the whole EU project, not only are we not facing up the challenges, but we are also holding countries back by making them dependent on our subsidies, and they're not really facing the challenges. I sit on the International Trade Committee, and there was I won't say which one, but there was a Caribbean minister who came along, and he said, yes, of course we understand all this about restructuring, but we also want to see protection of traditional and non-traditional industries. Mm-hmm. And when I added that up, I thought traditional and non-traditional, that's everything, isn't it? And for some reason, he didn't quite seem to get that point. No, it blows me. The other thing is, we are still sticking to a 1950s post-war consensus social model in Europe. And I don't think that we're ever going to pull out of that. And I want to hasten the decline in legitimacy of that model. If you look at Central and Eastern Europe, and I did a lot of work in the early 90s in Central and Eastern Europe, as I know Sean and Tim and many others did. I did a lot of work in Hungary. I remember talking to residents of these countries, but probably some here as well. And so the important thing there was that the old system lost its legitimacy. That's why we can make that radical change. One of the first steps, the sociologists say, one of the first steps of change is realisation. If you look at post-war Western Europe, the post-war social model in the EU, what we have is a social model, whatever that means. So I don't think it's a social model when you've got 20% unemployment in some countries. How is that a social model? You have this model that has not yet lost its legitimacy. There are still people arguing for it. There are still people arguing for 35-hour weeks and high minimum wage. And all they're doing is really doing is arguing for pricing themselves out of the market. They don't really understand yet that's lost, that they're losing competitiveness. This week I was asked to speak about the French riots, and after I'd apologised for starting them, I made the point that it's supposed to be a social model, but what it's proven is a model for social unrest. And then people were asking, well, what about the similarities with Britain in the early 80s and Brixton and Tops's? I said, actually, if you look at what happened in Britain after Tops's and what happened after the Brixton riots, what happened is that we had economic growth in this country. And when you have Thatcher toughed it out. And when you have economic growth actually disproportionately benefits the poorest members of our society. Because quite often for the poorest members of our society, economic growth is the difference between having a job and not having a job. And that's one of the major driving factors. Maybe Christian might disagree with it, but it's one of the major driving factors behind these riots. I was reading the blogs between the different rioters, and as well as sort of France challenging Strasbourg and saying you're not burning enough cars. I thought that was healthy competition. As well as sort of challenge each other to burn more cars. And there's someone from the Ile-de-France, from Paris, saying, "You provincials, you're so pathetic. You burn 15 cars a night. We're burning 100. Come back and talk to us when you're serious." There was a very interesting blog, when he went through all that, which said, "We send our CV in, no one replies. You're going to have to listen now, aren't you?" And I thought that was quite profound. It was really a desperate cry for jobs and economic growth. That's what some of the press have tried to cover it up and tried to mask it as Al Qaeda in Paris, and things like that. But actually, the simple reason behind it was the lack of economic growth, the lack of opportunities. And I think, frankly, you have to blame a social model for that. Why are so many young people unemployed? It's sluggish economic growth and it's lack of opportunities. What happens to all my unemployed French friends? They become employed in Britain. It's as simple as that. They come here. I don't know how I got onto that. Anyway, but I think actually the challenge that's been faced is one where people are now starting to blame, if you like, in France are now starting to blame the EU for its malaise, particularly after expansion. What happened with the 10 new countries that came, which I think is a wonderful thing to happen. And I just want to see the EU expand and expand and expand, so it doesn't become too deep and just implodes or whatever. But that's an aside. What's very important is that the whole culture there. I speak to parliamentarians from, I'll try not to be patronised about this, because Central and Eastern Europe, from Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Baltic states, and they say, we did not join the EU. We did not throw off 40 years of communism just to be told how to be governed from Brussels. and the French don't like that. When they hear that, the French and German politicians who believe in sort of the French-German axis and their sort of their vision and the Jean Monnet vision, they believe it's a wicked Anglo-Saxon conspiracy. Mm-hmm. I wish it were. I wish it were a wicked Anglo-Saxon conspiracy, but it's not. But it's one of the reasons that the French voted no in the referendum in France. What's interesting is that the Dutch also voted no, but for different reasons. They actually want to see a far more liberal Europe. Probably the reason that we would vote no in Britain. But the result would be the same. If we were allowed to vote in a referendum on the Constitution, we would probably vote no because we believe that we should have far more liberal laws and we shouldn't be governed from Brussels. But also, we don't want to sort of more restrictive directives that would damage our market. So that brought me on to this is where it brought me onto an interesting dilemma, because my initial reaction to the French referendum and a Dutch referendum result was to say it's quite clear why they voted no, and they voted no for different reasons, But on the whole, they were voting no because they were voting against a one-size-fits-all Europe. So my initial reaction was to say, what we should realise about the EU and what we should realise when we talk about competition, we should be talking about not only about competition between firms offering consumers their goods and services, but what we should also be talking about is competition between different economic and social models. What that means is that if in Britain we want to have a more liberalised market and open up our market to anyone who wants to come in and not have protected industries or sensitive industries, and I still can't understand why the French consider yoghurt a sensitive industry, you know, we should be allowed to do so. And if the French want to adopt a different model and want to spend a lot of their so much of their budget on agriculture and sustaining, you know, unviable farmers, they should be allowed to do so. But it should not be enforced at the European level. Therefore, we should have competition between different economic systems or different economic models. And that moves away from the one-size-fits-all. That was my instinctive reaction at first. I said, you know, there are those who talk about competition, but actually they want harmonisation. And competition should be between different economic systems as well as between different firms. But then I started to hear the flip side of this argument. And the argument was something like this. First, as a British politician, I should think of British interests, and I understand that. Is it really fair that we open up our markets to foreign firms? I don't mean that in a derogatory way, you know, to non-British firms who can take advantage of our liberalised market, yet British firms find it difficult to compete in those markets. And that's where the political discussion came in, and political considerations. You know, it's all about a level playing field, I'd say, and I'm always suspicious of this level playing field argument. But what it means is that, in effect, you know, and I'll give you the example of the electricity industry. EDF from France can come in and quite happily buy up British firms and supply services to us as customers, but it's very difficult for British companies to go out there and do the same. There is an argument, and I see this argument, well, why not? If the French taxpayer wants to subsidise my electricity, you know, as a British consumer, I'm very happy for that to happen. But it's a very difficult argument to make as a politician, because it seems to be unfair competition. Therefore, should I then be saying, well, actually, what we need is liberalisation, and we need to enforce liberalisation across the EU. What I now term coercive liberalisation. Should we be engaging in coercive liberalisation? Because surely that's what we believe in. That's what we want to see. We want to see economic liberalism and social liberalism. We want to see markets open up, not only across the EU, but across the world. And should we use, as one of my libertarian friends said to me, we should use all the tools at our disposal, even if that means EU directives and EU legislation. We should be using those to open up other markets, and we should be engaging in coercive liberalisation. So that's a dilemma I face, particularly when it comes to internal market issues. I really do not know, it's a terrible thing for a politician to say he doesn't know, but I don't know, where I fall on that argument. On the whole, I think I'd like to see competition between different economic systems and let the best economic system win, and then everyone suddenly falls in line and realises that's a great economic system. It's working, it's creating jobs, and we're falling way behind. But on the other hand, should I really be using the tools that are available at my disposal or our disposal, and using the EU as an institution to further liberalisation and to open up markets? I think I'll leave it there for now. And what I'd like to hear really is answers and suggestions on how to resolve that philosophical dilemma.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Kamall for a very interesting talk. I'd also like to note that we have experienced the very unusual fact of a politician's standing up and saying, I do not know the answer to something.
Yeah, that surprises me.
Yeah. Politicians always have answers, even when they don't understand the problems. Here we have somebody who is trying to understand the nature of the problem and to reach a reasoned answer. I must admit, I wonder how long Syed will last. But, anyway,
So is my wife.
Yes. Very well. I think we can pull rank and Dr. Chris Tain.
A very wise decision.
I disagree.
I'd like to give my sort of papal pronouncement on the should people be forced to be free dilemma. I think the argument is that they shouldn't. Not because necessarily you have no entitlement to do so. No government has an entitlement to, in fact, impose protectionism upon its populace, even if the majority of the populace wants to be protected. In other words, no state has the right to actually interfere in true free trade. On the other hand, free trade will only be adhered to in the long run and in the ultimate analysis if the people, the recipients of it, so to speak, think that it's in their interest. So the consequence of forcing people to be free in the context of what is actually becoming a super state in the European Union will be, in fact, not actually to gain the victory of free trade, but to create a populations enraged, probably enraged and forced into nationalism, people who don't want to follow that policy because, foolishly, they think it's against their own interests, when it isn't. But nevertheless, the free trade won't stick. So free trade will only stick if people think that it's in their interest. And I think that's a universal truth, and it applies in the context of a federal superstate, or it applies in the context of an independent nation, such as, well, Britain used to be. Free trade flourished, and Britain flourished under free trade, but when socialist propaganda and high Tory protectionist propaganda convinced people it was against their interest, then we abandoned it. And the same will happen in Europe. So the idea that you can get a quick fix by coercion, by forcing people to be free, I think is a fundamental strategic error. You'll only create public dissent, public dissatisfaction, and the eventual overthrow of that forced freedom. Freedom will only stick if, in fact, it's adoptive freedom. You can't force it upon people. That's my pronouncement.
I will come on to Paul Marks and John Mallor and various other people in a moment. But is there anybody who disagrees with what Chris has just said? And you are allowed, within minutes, to disagree with
I'll take
that.
names.
Okay, Rachel Tingle, you have to go over it.
It's really quick, but I mean, Chris was basing his argument on the fact that it wouldn't be in people's advantage, that people wouldn't want to continue this because they didn't think it was to their advantage to do it. But after it's been imposed, since it will be their advantage, they might appreciate that it is to their advantage, in which case their attitude could well change. And you could say, to take an example from British domestic policy, that Thatcher, as it were, imposed freedom against the wishes of most of the Conservative Party, even, on the population. And having done so, a lot of the people who were totally opposed to her policies came round to supporting those policies, including sections of the Labour Party, of course. So I'm not sure that I agree entirely with Chris's mind.
Thank you. Paul Marks, you've been putting your hand up quite a lot.
Oh, nervous tick. There is an answer to your question, so I don't actually have to analyse it philosophically because it's already been answered by history. In 1986, the Single European Act was sold to Margaret Hilda Thatcher and the others as a great deregulating measure. This would indeed force Europe to be free. It would mean massive deregulation. I remember the debates well. A few voices, such as Lord Denning, queried it, but the vast majority, no, this would be deregulation. What it in fact led to, by giving power to the centre, was a gigantic avalanche of regulations. Not deregulation, but regulation. So it brings me on to the whole suspicion of the modernisation agenda. You said, isn't it terrible we're spending 40% of the budget on agriculture? I don't care. I want the budget smaller. I don't want them spending it on other things, which is what Mr. Blair wants, and what he's now trying to force through, as you know. You say, isn't it terrible that they have these arcane procedures in Parliament? I don't care about that either. If you make it more efficient, it'll do even more. Yep. You don't want power to the centre. We already have the historical experience of what they will in fact do. Yes, I agree absolutely. They will scream freedom. But that is not what they will do, because it's not what they've done. They've done precisely the opposite.
Thank you, very well put again, Paul. I would have John Lalor, but I think Richard Garner.
Yes. Yeah. I'd just like to echo what Paul and Chris said. As Barry Goldwater once said, that a government big enough to give you everything is big enough to take it away. And an EU that's big enough to impose economic freedom on every single country is big enough to be influenced to take it all away from everybody. So our freedoms might be endangered by our attempts to impose them on others. And I also have a suggestion. If, as you implied at the beginning, it's slightly utopian to talk about with immediate withdrawal, whether it's possible to possibly persuade the French and Germans to just leave.
I'll take John Lalor, and then I'll ask, would you like to reply after that, and then we'll take some more points, or would you like the comments to run on?
Continue the conversation.
Okay, John Lalor. And
You
then
asked- You asked for people who were disagreeing with
yes.
Kamall. I'm not sure if I am. I'm not sure if I heard it correctly, but you were saying about whether it was logical or not to be trading with people who impose tariffs against your product. So let's just say you have a very highly deregulated drugs industry or something like that, but you're trading with a country that is highly regulated. I'm not sure if you were saying you were against that sort of thing, as sort of a tit, because it can have an effect of a tit for tat. Like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1931 under Hoover in America, that brought the massive avalanche of global tariffs, which brought about 1930s depression, which, well, God knows, we saw what happened by the end of the 30s as a result of it. So the tit-for-tat nature of that can have a worse consequence than you saying, no, we don't want to trade with you because you're blocking our products. Countries like Singapore and especially Hong Kong, as we can see, surrounded by barbarian economic societies at the time, still grew economically, despite the fact that they were trading, let's just say, with Philippines or whatever, who were putting massive tariffs on the more free market products. I'm sorry, the products from more free market countries like Singapore and Hong Kong. They still benefited, even though I'm sure they resented it. The second point, briefly, is I'm not like you were saying about not really having the answers. I'm not sure how I feel about the effect that the EU is having in Ireland. Me being Irish, of course, is we were saying about imposing freedom. And I see the point that lady made about Thatcher imposing freedom. Thank God she did. But we have a completely regulated, monopolised postal system on postage and envelopes. And but by 2009, it will be deregulated, not because of what the law in Ireland is saying, the legislation. It's actually through Brussels. And I have serious problems with that, because I realise that deregulation, and I mean they're kicking up such a fuss at the moment, the unions. The deregulation is not coming from us, it's coming from Europe. And I hate to say, I'm bloody glad of it.
Sure. I mean, actually, that probably is one of the. Sorry, I'll stand up. That's probably one of the arguments that I use in favour of coercive liberalisation, which makes it more difficult for me. You know, when I'm sort of stacking up the arguments on both sides, because in the UK, I mean, I remember, you know, we liberalised our telecom sector, and our postal sector is about to be liberalised next year in the UK, way ahead of the rest of the EU. But actually, as a result of EU legislation, it meant that French consumers were able to benefit from competition. Spanish consumers were able to benefit from competition. You know, a whole number of countries where you would not have expected liberalisation and competition benefited because of the imposition, if you like, of economic freedom from the EU. And that's what makes it more difficult for me. Yeah, please do, yes.
It's the fact that these things were brought about, but it would be wrong to sort of adopt, for, say, a capitalist, to adopt a crony capitalist point of view and sort of getting in bed with government, big business and all that. But we're not, because it's not favourites, it's because we have a system imposed on us which is highly undemocratic. So by God, we might as well use it for our advantage.
Good point. Philip van der Elst and then David Goldstone.
Is I'm not sure whether I'm adding to confusion, Syed, or not. I mean, I think the issue you raised is a very important one, and it's very difficult to know what the right answer is. But I think some light might be shed on this problem by noting what economists like Dr. Martin Holmes have pointed out, which is that there is a difference between harmonisation policy and policy that really opens up markets and competition. And he's argued that the fundamental error within European policy making, and which Thatcher didn't see through at the time, was that what really ought to be happening is that we ought to be able to recognise each other's standards, different standards, and then leave it up to consumers whether they're going to buy products from different countries and different industries who are ruled by these different standards, as opposed to imposing one standard, which then means that lots of British companies would fall foul of those standards and have to go out of business. So I think that's the difference between harmonisation and recognising each other's standards and allowing free trade on that basis. So it's really quite complex.
Sure.
Okay, David Goldstone.
Yeah, you talked about coercive liberalisation. A dangerous phrase, I think, because
I'll try to be provocative.
there must surely be a distinction between the sort of coercive liberalisation that we see in Iraq, which involves dropping bombs and killing people on the one hand, and the sort of coercive liberalisation which you, I think, are talking about, which is through peaceful means, getting rid of chunks of statism and regulation. And I cannot see how there can be any objection to the latter if what you are doing is bringing about fewer laws and fewer regulations. I would have thought that must be a good thing, as long as nobody's person or property is hurt.
There would be objections. I mean, there are objections to coercive liberalisation, even if I mean in a non-violent sense, which I do.
There are undoubtedly objections.
And there are always objections, but especially from interest groups.
Your question, as I understand it,
Sure.
was what ought you to be doing?
Yes.
And my answer is that if people and their property are not being hurt
Yes.
by a process of de-statism, that must be a good thing and not a bad thing.
Okay.
Okay, I'm giving preferential treatment to those people who have not spoken. So Paul Cooler.
Your philosophical dilemma seems to be sort of a European dimension to a problem that's been discussed a lot in American libertarianism about the states' rights or secession from the state and the federal government, and whether the libertarian strategy ought to be to try and convince Supreme Court judges to impose libertarianism from their rulings, or whether you want to try and have things. There's a huge sort of discussion about it in America, and a lot of interesting things. And a very good article written on this that summarises a lot of the problems by Walter Block and Stefan Kinsella on the Mises Institute website. You can look it up there. It raises a lot of the things, and there's a lot of discussion. My own view is that I don't think there is a principled, correct answer to this. There's Chris's view, which is the secessionist view that you should always see, but secession itself, or letting people decide in small numbers or competition things, can increase a lot of ratcheting. Giving Scotland in its own parliament, all that does is just give the Scots trying to ratchet up socialism sort of massively that they wouldn't have. On the other hand, some countries coming into the EU may end up being slightly more liberal than they are. So I think there isn't a principal answer. You can only decide these things on an ad hoc basis. But I think that one mustn't be foolish to the predominant nature of various things. And I think Paul's characterisation of what the EU is actually all about is there. So my view is that Britain ought to leave the EU at the earliest possible opportunity. But while we're in it, I think one should vote to impose liberal laws where that genuinely means you're removing impediments and restrictions and impositions on people's individual lives.
Well, that's interesting because not only is there the European dimension, there's a global dimension.
Yes.
Which is, how do I convince countries around the world to open up their markets? Do I hope that they sign up to a multilateral body, such as WTO, or we have bilateral agreements where we try and enforce, in return for them getting something from us, they open up. But I suppose you say, well, actually that's not coercive because they're doing it because they see the benefit of that. But or do we just continue to sort of open up our markets, and because we'll benefit anyway, even if other markets don't open up. There'll be some markets that open up, but we'll continue to benefit because we'll have more efficient industry, etc., and all the arguments. And then other countries will realise that our model is, liberalisation is the way forward. So there's also a global dimension, not only a European dimension.
Well, I would say we shouldn't trade off. I think we should liberalise unilaterally whatever other people are doing. We shouldn't get into trade wars and try and trade off these things. We have the power to do so.
Thank you. I will take Philip Chaston, but before then, I would like to take a point from somebody who hasn't so far said anything. Richard Evelyn?
That's the point of how does one deal with other nations? Does one act unilaterally in trade liberalization or hope for reciprocity? said here, let me find the exact passage, we came to the conclusion that the less we attempted to persuade foreigners to adopt our trade principles, the better. For we discovered so much suspicion of the motives of England that it was lending an argument to the protectionist abroad to incite the popular feelings against the free traders. To take away this pretense, we avowed our total indifference whether other nations became free traders or not. But we should abolish protection for our own selves and leave other countries to take whatever course they like best. And if I can just be indulged one more minute, in June of 1846, when Sir Robert Peel, in opposition to his own Tory party, pushed through the abolition of the Corn Laws, the Tories turned on him and made him step down as Prime Minister. In his stepping down speech, I guess you'd call it, he said the following: "If other countries choose to buy in the dearest market, such an option on their part constitutes no reason why we should not be permitted to buy in the cheapest. I trust the government will not resume the policy which they and we have felt most inconvenient, namely, the haggling with foreign countries about reciprocal concessions, instead of taking the independent course which we believe conducive to our own interests. Let us trust to the influence of public opinion in other countries. Let us trust that our example, with the proof of practical benefit we derive from it, will at no remote period ensure the adoption of the principles on which we have acted, rather than defer indefinitely by delay equivalent concessions from other countries. Just follow a unilateral policy and do what you know to be best, both as a matter of principle and as practical benefit."
Thank you, Richard. It was good in the intellectual sense to breathe the freer air of Victorian England, even for a few minutes. Now, I'll call on Brian Micklethwaite, as he so far hasn't said anything, and then I'll call on Philip Chaston, who's been waiting quite a while. Brian.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. I think it's possible that Paul Marx could soon be wrong about the European Union. I think it's likely that he's going to go on being right, but it's possible that he could be proved wrong. The reason I say this is that my sense is that the rulers of Europe have spent the last few decades creating their superstate. Damn the consequences, damn the costs, and damn any harm it does to the European Union's economy. They've simply been getting it all stitched up. They're very nearly at the end of this process. When they have completed it, they will then possibly turn their attention to the question of actually becoming the superpower that I'm sure they all want to preside over, because it will make them more grand and important and rich. At that point, you may face a much more sharp dilemma than Paul is suggesting you will face. Because at that point, they might decide to go flat out, as hard as they can, much harder than they have so far, for liberalisation, on the grounds that their problem will no longer be making the European Union bigger in geographical terms, but making it stronger in economic terms.
Okay. Philip Chaston?
Okay. Pardon my enthusiasm. One of the reasons I want to speak now was this is one of the few occasions where I can actually talk about my day job, which is within a industry which is already within the single market, insurance, and working for passporting, that is the ability of companies to trade on a freedom of services basis throughout European member states. What my company finds when attempting to do so is that the single market is far less efficacious than European political classes or political propaganda will warrant. The single market allows individual member states to parcel up certain rules under what is pronounced as the general good for reasons of consumer protection or other matters that they can find. Then, when you actually attempt to trade in those countries, you find that you still have to comply with a certain number of rules that essentially limit the amount that you can do. So therefore, if you're an insurance company, if you wanted to write on a personal lines basis, that is, householders, motor, or whatever, you find yourself far more constricted in what you can do than if you're going to ride usually nuclear energy or your normal large lines of business. The other thing, and this is where Britain is so important, is that we shouldn't just blame the European Union for these matters. If you look at, say for example, a European court judgment which was recently passed on indirect taxation and outsourcing, you're probably slightly aware of this, you would have found that outsourcing in Britain, especially insurers, suddenly became liable to VAT. Why? Because the definition of an insurance outsourcer under the Insurance Directive differs from the definition of an outsourcer under the 6th VAT Directive. From this contradiction, suddenly insurance companies find they have a far larger VAT bill. And then they find that the Customs and Revenue interprets that European Court of Justice judgment in such a way that it gathers more money. So therefore, it's not only how the European Parliament, how the European institutions interact, it's also how their directives, their judgments are interpreted by the gold plating of the regulators and tax authorities within the United Kingdom. So therefore, any argument that harmonisation or liberalisation will occur is in fact incorrect, because it depends upon the individual institutions of that member state.
Derek Bernard?
Oh, sorry, Derek Kamall, forgive me. I've been quite pleased so far.
You have indeed. Derek Bernard. I have to take grave exception to Brian's comment. I think human history shows that that simply isn't what happens. When you have a regulatory structure driven by bureaucrats, driven by people who have a very powerful and quite well supported view that they're more intelligent, more able, more competent than the normal hoi polloi, then that group of people can never have enough power or regulation. And the road ends up in North Korea. That is the story. And the idea that that group of people will suddenly see the light and say, we've got enough power, we've got it together, we can now be a free, genuine free market, simply doesn't happen on its own.
No.
And I speak as I campaigned as best I could 35 years ago, 37 years ago, 35 years ago, for the United Kingdom to join the common market. And slowly and painfully, over the 30 years that have passed since then, I've come to the realization, if you like, my personal perception today, that what I've just said is true, and that the perception that we know best, because we're ever so well educated, and we've talked to all these other international people, and we know best what is right, is so strong and so powerful that actually it is the road to damnation. And I have to say to Dr. Kamall that I like to think I understood your conundrum, I hope. From my perspective, there is no solution to the idea of making Brussels a smaller, cheaper, more an organisation capable of allowing things to happen. It simply cannot happen. That is not in the nature of this type of structure. And if I'm to change that perception, I need people like you to say to me, you're wrong, actually Europe is getting better, because everything I see is Europe's getting worse. The EU is going downhill, and the members in the EU who make the statements at Lisbon about the dynamic economy simply don't grasp what it means. They're empty words which actually are simply covering up a desperately serious descent into long-term madness.
Thank you. started late, and so we will finish late, if you don't mind, but I would like to call on Syed to give a summing up and perhaps a reply to some of the points raised so far.
The easy answer, we say, is that I agree with all of you. But that would not be an answer. There are 2 points I particularly want to pick up during the discussion. One is about EU membership or getting out of the EU. I did not bring that up on purpose because we're not talking about getting out of the EU at the moment. And it may be a solution. I am more and more ready to be persuaded that we should leave the EU. In fact, I instinctively think we should leave the EU, but the reason I don't argue for leaving the EU is because I don't feel that I'm equipped with the arguments, or robustly equipped, to deal with the arguments of those who want to stay. And I never take a position until I feel I can argue that position confidently. So I am not at the stage where I can confidently argue for withdrawal from the EU, which it doesn't mean so therefore we are in the EU at the moment, and I'm trying to solve a dilemma that I face almost on a daily basis when it comes to votes. Not an argument that where should we be. I'm not addressing that argument. That argument, I think, will take care of itself, and I think the debate will go on. And actually, it's down to national governments. It's not down to me as a member of the European Parliament whether we stay in the EU or come out. It depends on if we have a Conservative government that has the courage of its convictions, that believes that enough liberty and freedom has been taken away from this country to pull us out. So that's why I don't address it. And I hope that doesn't sound like a cop-out, but I just don't think I am in a position to make that decision one way or the other. For example, it's one of the reasons that I don't sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee and make grand pronouncements on things like Israel and Palestine or whatever. Because despite what I think of my own abilities, and I've got a pretty big ego, I think world peace is a little bit beyond me at the moment. I try to stick to the issues that I believe I face on a day-to-day basis. So when it comes to membership, there probably is an argument for leaving the EU, and I think it's getting more and more powerful, but I can't make that argument at the moment. And I'm constantly weighing that up. But I think on balance we should leave, but I'm not prepared to go on a platform and argue for that because I don't have the arguments. Harmonisation came up. I am not talking about harmonisation. Where it comes to harmonisation and recognition, I believe it should. I always come down on mutual recognition. It should be as simple as that. And I agree with you. We should not be harmonising. And we talk about competition, but the instinct of those who talk about competition at the EU level, in particular, is to harmonise and effectively harmonise competition out of existence. And I believe in competition between standards even. Let the consumer decide. So I agree with you, Philip, on that. But I still face this dilemma, and I think I've got the answer that I can't resolve it. That's where I think I'm coming down in terms. So I've had this discussion. I've put this similar debate. I've tried to sort of stimulate a similar debate in a number of different places since I became an MEP in May. Some people just don't understand the argument, frankly, but I thought today it was the first time I had an audience that actually understood the dilemma I faced. And it just seems to be there's not an answer and I have to deal with it probably on an individual basis. I would like, though, to thank you all for contributing to it. I know you're all web savvy, so you can all find me on the web, but if you have a particular point to make, or a particular contribution to make, or you think I haven't thought of something, or you want to reinforce my argument one way or the other, please do email me, please do contact me. I never want to stop thinking, if that makes sense to you, and I think too many politicians do once they get elected. I want to carry on challenging my views and carry on debating issues as I continue through my political career. So thank you very much.
There are many things that I could say about Syed's performance over the last hour, but I think the highest compliment that you can ever pay to a politician is to say thank you for being honest with us. And Syed, I think, has been transparently honest. It's a shame he sits somewhere in Belgium and not in Westminster. Yeah.